Welcome everybody to the session. On behalf of RTI, I'd like to just welcome everybody to the session. And my name is Daniel Lapidus. I lead RTI's Center for Climate Solutions. RTI's mission is to improve the human condition by turning knowledge into practice. And the reason I'm really excited about this panel is because it's really about practice. It's like these are really practical examples and practical solutions to how to use carbon finance to mitigate climate change, but also to get benefits to smallholder farmers. So, with that, I want to introduce our moderator, Razia Bakai, from the Africa Bureau and at USAID, and she's going to be moderating the panel today. So, Razia.
Hi, everyone. My name is Razia Bakai. I want to welcome you to Enabling Smallholder Farmers to Leverage Carbon Markets at Scale. I really just want to set the scene before I introduce our panel, and then we can also have some time afterwards to have some questions and answers. And then also, if there's anything else that comes up, please save those thoughts, and we will have that time also for questions. When we look at carbon markets, this is something that USAID has been working for quite a long time. And it plays a critical role in helping the agriculture sector to reach net zero while also adapting to the changing climate. But primarily, we've been focusing on large and medium scale farmers. And in one of the areas we've identified that's a gap that really we could further focus on for USAID and for other development partners is looking at small scale farmers. And one of the things is that we really need to look at those global emissions that comes from agriculture, forestry, and other land use. And when we think about this, it's just how do we interconnect our smallholder farmers to be able to leverage what they're already producing and how to also engage them within the climate change and the support of carbon markets. So today we're going to talk about those opportunities on the ground. We're going to hear from some of our partners and really be able to delve into what are some further opportunities that we can catalyze our support in other development agencies. So I'm going to introduce our panel today. We have Martina Janssen, who's the head of supply for Acorn at Rabobank. We have Tracy Mitchell, who's the director of resilience and climate adaptation at RTI International. And we have Stephen Braun, senior director of private sector engagement at Winrock International. So now that we've talked about some of the challenges, which is smallholder farmers, they're the ones experiencing the impacts of climate change. They're the most vulnerable. And we really need to think about how they can become more resilient. And what are some of those practices and what are some of those things we're really working on the ground? I'll start off with Martina, who's at Rabobank. In your experience, what have you done with respect to voluntary carbon markets? And what is the role of climate finance? You're thinking really engaging these smallholder farmers.
Thanks, Razia, and also thanks for everyone, because I'm impressed that there's still quite a few people in these rooms after so many days. So it's lovely to see all of you. I work at Rabobank and I work at the innovation department. And quite a while back, obviously Rabobank is a food and agricultural bank, and directly and indirectly, a lot of our the farmers that we work with are smallholder farmers. So we felt that it is our role to look at how can we support and play a role in fighting climate change and land degradation and food security or food insecurity. And smallholders have an important role to play there. So what we looked at was that we really believe in agroforestry to benefit the farmers. And I understand that's not a one-size-fits-all, but in a lot of cases, agroforestry can benefit smallholders in becoming more climate resilient, but also increasing the quality of the soil, and with that, ensure that productivity levels stay at a certain level. And that is where we started with, where we said we really hope that we can stimulate more farmers to make a switch to agroforestry. Um, and then we looked at the carbon market as a tool, a means to an end, to try to stimulate more farmers to make a switch by generating an initial income stream and make that switch to agroforestry more financially sustainable. But like you said, when looking at smallholder farmers and the carbon market, there's quite a gap. It's a complicated system. To get certified is complex, is costly, but also measuring and monitoring is complex and costly. And that is where we have innovated or tried to innovate, and I think we have been successful. By, on the one hand side, making sure that we drafted our own framework and methodology that really was directed at smallholder agroforestry only to really make it more suitable, and using remote sensing as a way of measurement. That was approved by Plan Vivo as a certifier. Not always well known to everyone, but comparable to Vera and Gold Standard, but more dedicated to smallholder farmers. And they approved the ACORN program, meaning that individual projects don't need to certify on an individual basis. That reduces complexity, reduces cost. We use satellite data to remotely measure, and if you do that on a global scale, like we try to do, that significantly reduces cost as well. And then we want to ensure full transparency, full traceability, and we're talking about smallholders, so there's a lot of additional benefits in addition to the removals when you talk about agroforestry systems. And because of that, we market this as high quality credits. And we sell them for a premium price, currently at 35 euros per credit. And we want to ensure that the majority of the money goes back to the farmers that in the end do the work, right? And that need to maintain those trees. So we say 80% of that needs to flow back to the farmers. We keep 10% as a Rabobank to cover for the cost of certification, of monitoring, of marketing of the credits. 10% can go to the local partners, and those are critical for us because those are the organizations on the ground that have the network and work with the farmers. They're also the one supporting the farmers. And that 10% is to cover the additional cost that they're making to onboard the farmers onto the Acorn platform. That is what we have been doing for the past 2 years. We have now around 250, I think it's 242,000 farmers on our platform from Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And in Asia, it's only India at this moment. We've sold 250,000 credits, and with that, disbursed around $5 million back to the farmers. And really, for us, it's a start. We want to scale this substantially. And we hope that with that, it's going to be an impactful amount that really flows back into the hand of the farmers. And where we're together with USAID is that this is nice and this might sound nice, but there's still one challenge, and that is we're only compensating when there's actual carbon sequestration, actual carbon removal happening. And that's when the tree has grown to a certain level. However, the costs are at the beginning, right? When you need to plant the trees and when you need to implement. So there was a cash flow problem. So what we try to establish now is a financing facility that finances that cost at the beginning to be repaid by the future carbon removal units. And to do that in a way that is working out, so to limit the interest rates and to ensure that we can have a very long tenor, you need to work with different financiers to make it work. And we're very happy to have USAID on board to provide a first loss to that facility. And we hope to close a full facility of 100 million by Q2 next year, to have that live and to make sure that we can provide those loans to start implementing at scale. Sorry, long answer.
That's great.
I think it's on automatically.
Is this one on? Okay, great. Thanks so much, Martina. Some of the key things I heard you say was engaging with smallholder farmers, who are the majority of your customers, really bringing them along, and then also making sure you can incentivize them by having them understand what's their second benefit for actually entering into agroforestry. I think that's really important. So it's basically capacity building, making sure we can engage them and have them understand what are the benefits. And then really looking at the development side, thinking about USAID, how other development partners can come in and really help subsidize the initial cost, which is at the startup level. I think that's really important. But as we look into going further, I want to look at RTI and see where you're working already in this space for carbon markets. And also, what is the role of NGOs? Not from a banking perspective, but really looking at how you partner on the ground and how do you implement.
Yeah, thanks for that. Um, so today I'm going to focus on an activity that RTI has been implementing in Ethiopia. And it's a large Feed the Future activity called Ethiopia Transforming Agriculture. And in that activity, we're striving to improve access to healthy diets for 7 million people. And so we're focused on a wide range of nutritious and income-generating crops and livestock products. But one of them is milk. In each of the 7 regions where we're working, the local communities identified milk as having high potential and also high need. So as we're thinking about ways to increase the productivity of milk in these communities, obviously one of the concerns is that there's a considerable methane emission from the dairy sector. And for those of you who may not be aware, Ethiopia has the largest livestock population in Africa. And when you look at methane maps of the continent, Ethiopia lights up. And so we want to improve access to healthy diets, including milk, but we also wanted to be environmentally responsible and to do something to reduce the methane intensity of milk. And so in the dairy sector, there are methodologies for addressing methane in the smallholder sector, and it's focused on reducing the methane intensity for a per liter of milk or per cow. And so the types of things that first we engaged with our local partners on the ground to identify the most promising opportunities to do that. And in doing that, we identified one dairy. It's called Family Milk. It's the second largest dairy processor in Ethiopia that was really committed to that to that objective, and really wanted to get on board and was willing to invest some of their own funds in doing that. We also identified a business development services partner called First Consult, an Ethiopian firm that was willing to work with that dairy processor to help them commercialize and operationalize a system. And then, there were a host of other government and non-governmental partners to really identify the specific solutions they were going to do. And so what they identified was to provide feed, animal health, and advisory services through the dairy to their suppliers. So they're currently supplied by 10,000 smallholder farmers. And they have a daily transaction with these farmers. They collect milk from them. And so they're in a unique position to be able to provide them with feed, to provide them with veterinary and other types of services on a credit basis, and then to withhold the payment for those services from their regular milk check. And so in doing that, they can reduce, this is something that we at RTI piloted and measured in Kenya, where we were able to do something very similar. We increased the productivity of milk per cow by 47% and reduced the methane intensity per liter of milk by 28%. And this is through really simple feed changes, really simple management practices. This isn't like high technology. But in doing that and tying it to a carbon credit methodology, which has not been done before, what we want to do is to actually reward this dairy and their supply chain for moving towards net zero. So this is something that we're at the early stages of implementing. We have a partner in South Africa called the Climate Neutral Group, who is a carbon developer. who has experience working with livestock methane, but only for commercial farmers because it hasn't been done with smallholder farmers. And initially, it was challenging to get them on board. Looking at how are we going to monitor 10,000 smallholder farmers? How are we going to overcome these barriers? And so we have some ideas for how to do that, but we don't have all the answers at this stage. But what we are committed to is to finding a solution, iterating, adaptively managing this activity, and layering in on top of this large USAID project so that we can not only improve access to healthy diets, but we can do it in a way that's more environmentally and climate responsible.
Thanks so much, Tracy. I think one of the things that I've heard between both Martina and Tracy is that there's this need for engagement, making sure that we can go out to smallholder farmers, really make sure they're aware of the opportunities. And in the case of 10,000, that's huge looking at livestock and dairy. But I think one thing you touched upon is that this is not only important for climate change and being able to look at methane gas, but also looking at nutrition and food security, which is also very critical for USAID, and looking holistically at where we want to be able to work. So I think it's wonderful to see what RTI is actually working on the ground. Stephen, as we look at Winrock and some of its work as well, if you could give some examples of how it's approaching carbon markets or carbon finance, we'd love to hear about that as well.
I think it's on. Yeah, we got it. Okay, good. Winrock's an international NGO, primarily U.S. government funded. We're an implementer of major U.S. government funded projects around the world. What makes us a bit unique in this space is that we've been present at COP from the beginning. We also have ACR as a subsidiary of Winrock. ACR was the first voluntary carbon registry. So what I want to do is provide 4 relatively brief examples of the work that we're doing in this space that provide different perspectives on the key topic that we're talking about today. So first of all, kind of leaning on our carbon registry experience and the decades of work, well, I shouldn't say, I can say decades of work that have been done in that space in terms of how to engage both indigenous rights holders and small landholders in the forest space. So the example that I want to bring up there, though, is more recent, and it's in Guyana. So in Guyana, Winrock is the Secretariat for the Architecture for REDD+ transactions, which is a methodology to, at a jurisdictional, at a country level, to promote forest conservation. And in Guyana, we closed what is now the largest single voluntary carbon market transaction ever to protect forests in Guyana. And through that project, the funding flows at a national level, first to the government. So 85% of the funding goes to the government, which is a big share. But it's spent on clean energy. It's spent on land titling for indigenous people. And it's spent on adaptation measures. Then 15% flows directly to the community, and the community has a democratic process for how that money is spent at the local level. Transitioning to Solomon Islands and a USAID-funded project that we're working on there, Solomon Islands has a significant issue with logging, massive deforestation happening in the Solomon Islands. In that case, we're actually working on kind of a combined carbon market project integrated with agroforestry. Plan Vivo is involved. Part of the challenge, again, as you mentioned, is this gap in timing, both for the carbon project and for some of the agroforestry products that need to be developed. So we're also working there on developing markets for existing forest products in the Solomon Islands that can be sold immediately. So the big thing there is obviously focusing on market development as opposed to just productivity. I think often in the development community, we focus a lot on productivity without ensuring that there's a strong market that already exists or that can be developed for that particular product. Going back to the US, so not necessarily how we would traditionally define smallholders in a developing world context, but in the US, we have a USDA-funded project that is helping marginalized farmers, Native American farmers, to gain access to carbon markets. In this case, we're talking about what we're calling GHG certificates. So this is part of the USDA Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities program. $3 billion in funding, 141 projects across the country. In our case, we're working on rice in the Mid-South region and cattle in the Upper Midwest. And in this case, we have active participation of Native American communities, of minority communities, other marginalized communities in the development of the standard that we're putting into place to ensure that it meets their needs, that they will participate, that the costs of doing so are reasonable in relation to the benefits that they'll receive. And then the last example, it's kind of a global example, but we also work with corporates. Nestle is an example where we're helping them determine strategies for decarbonization of commodity supply chains, and then also working with their suppliers to evaluate projects that Nestle wants to fund. So step one is Nestle is actually funding these projects, which is fantastic. Step two is how do we ensure that the funding that's flowing from Nestle to the suppliers is actually getting to the farmers on the ground. That's something we're going to be working with them on. We haven't started that yet, but this is a huge opportunity because there's so much corporate funding waiting, partly for standards to be clarified, but also for the right projects to be there that can actually help decarbonize their supply chains. So I mentioned that just as another example of how a different form of carbon finance can actually benefit smallholder farmers.
Thanks, Stephen. I want to mention something that you said, which is looking at indigenous groups and really engaging with them, and also marginalized populations within the U.S. I think when we look at smallholder farmers, we also need to look at, who are those end users and who are those, where is that engagement, and make sure that we are working with not only targeted groups, but we are also engaging with indigenous and marginalized populations, whether it be domestically or internationally. I want to go around and ask you each one more question before we open it up to the audience for some additional questions. And Martina, looking at it from a financial perspective as a bank, what are some of the challenges that you face? But really, as we look at scale up, how do we take this beyond what you're already working on? And how do we also engage other banks to enter into this sector to support smallholder farmers?
Great question, not an easy question. A couple of things. So when we're looking at scale, this is our big question. This is the thing that we're talking about all the time. How can we scale this? Because we need to have scale, right? And the concerns that we're having are not necessarily only finance related, but really risk related, right? Because it's going to be a balance between scaling and how do we, our question the whole time is how can we scale without or with ensuring that we also maintain the quality standards that we want to do? And I think that is for us a struggle sometimes to find the organizations to work with that can do this at a large scale. We can find the ones that can do this with 10,000 farmers, but that same organization, can they also do it with 100,000 farmers? And what is needed to get to 100,000 farmers? And that's then capacity building. To a large extent, right? To manage that, what is needed, and that's not only financing. It's oftentimes a lot more things that are more difficult to do than finance, which is organizational strengthening. But also on the side of the farmers, how do we ensure that the quality is there? Because you mentioned step 1 and 2, but I think there's a step 3 after that, and that's a step that we're also working a lot on, and that is how do we ensure that the farmers really, really understand that they're part of this carbon program, because it's such an intangible product, right? It's so difficult, but how do we ensure that the farmer still understands what this is, and also understands it in such a way that they understand that they have the choice to make, right? Do I want to be part of this carbon program, or do I want to choose another one? And to ask, okay, what is my share? What is the value of this? And why do you only get this much of it? These are the questions that we hope that the farmers at a certain point ask, because only when we know that they are really committed to be part of this, we feel more comfortable that they will engage for the longer term. And that, I think, is in the end the financial risk that we're all looking at. We're talking about programs of 20 years, right? So we're asking farmers, can you please keep the trees in the ground for 20 years plus another 20 years? It's long, right? So having that business case there, but also making sure that the farmers are fully understanding that is something that we're working with the local organizations. But in all fairness, I think a lot more needs to be done to actually nail that. So that is what we're thinking of and talking about the most within Acorn.
Thanks, Martina. Tracy, I'm looking at you. And you talked about how there are several partners that are part of the program. So when you work with the livestock and the dairy, there's also the non-governmental organizations, there's working with the government, as well as bringing and engaging all those partners. Are there any unintended consequences or challenges or lessons learned that you might want to just share that has been some of the pivotal moments that you take away as you work in this part?
I guess I would say, like, in terms of trade-offs, you know, one of the challenges that we're having is, you know, setting this up, developing this, getting the carbon developer, you know, doing the baseline, doing the monitoring. I mean, that costs money. And when we look at the price of carbon, I know you mentioned, I think, 35 euros a kilo or a ton. The price we've been quoted is $8 a ton for a mitigation ton, and that's low. I mean, one cow, we would be mitigating, you know, just under 1 ton per year, and so that's like $6 per cow, and so it's like that's not going to motivate a farmer to do something. But what it will do, and this is the way we're approaching it, by aggregating it at the dairy level, and the dairy is being supplied by 10,000 farmers, you know, and which, you know, equates to about 20,000 cows. Now that's turning into, you know, maybe $180,000 in a year. And so, you know, but you have to like measure. We're pursuing this because I think that the carbon prices will change. I think carbon is a valuable thing that will receive more value. I think methane, everyone's talking about methane, but it's discounted fourfold on the carbon markets because they're using the 100-year estimations instead of the 20-year estimations. They're totally discounting that it's a short-lived pollutant. And so I think as these things, I don't know, these are, I think, really, really serious. And so, you know, without having, you know, a USAID project behind it, I think it would be really challenging for a commercial business to implement on its own. And so when I think about then the unintended consequences sort of inaction, the nutrition is where we go because that is our goal in this activity. And, you know, if we don't do these things and if we don't get this right, not only is the climate, you know, not going to have a benefit, but, you know, the nutrition impact on vulnerable groups is going to become even worse. So it's kind of an indirect way of answering your question.
Tracy, you touched upon a great topic, which is going to be your question, Stephen, which is that, you know, you talked about Windrock being there from the beginning, and voluntary carbon markets have been around for a long time. What makes you optimistic or think that we can actually be successful in being able to not only engage shareholders, but, you know, with working through banks and NGOs and through institutions like Windrock?
Obviously, there's been a lot of controversy in the voluntary carbon markets recently. And we also need to distinguish between voluntary carbon markets, which can be used for offsetting, and some of the things that we're talking about, which sometimes stay within individual supply chains. So like the Nestle work that I'm talking about is different from that. So I think on one hand, like the type of work that we're doing with Nestle is not offsetting. There's a tremendous amount of money ready to flow into that space. And so I feel good about it because of the level of demand that we're seeing there. On the voluntary carbon market side, obviously there's been a glut recently because of concerns related to quality. And I think in any market, there's a transition period when there's a shakeout of lower quality products. And I think that's what's happening now. And I think this needed to happen. It was going to happen. It's going to happen again, most likely, hopefully in a different way, hopefully not as significant. But I think that's happening right now. And so I think the result of that is going to be an evolution in the market where there's going to be more of an emphasis on quality. And I think there will be a price rebound, and the proper valuation of these projects is going to come to pass. But we're not there right now, and we have to address the skepticism that's developed in this market. It's critical for obviously the ecosystems and the types of practices that we're trying to support, but also to the beneficiaries of these projects, which is obviously the purpose of this panel as well. We need that money flowing to these communities, to these farmers, et cetera. And without a strong, functioning, reliable voluntary carbon market, that's not going to happen.
Yeah. Earlier this week, I attended a session at the, I think it was the Food and Ag Pavilion, and CIOT announced that they just completed a global stock take of voluntary carbon credits in the ag sector. And they mentioned that, because it seems relatively new, but they mentioned that there were $9 million of ag carbon credits last year. There are 181 registered or completed carbon projects in the ag space, but there are 503 projects in the pipeline. And so, that's another thing that makes me optimistic. People are trying to find solutions and trying to figure out how to do this. But unfortunately, out of those 181 registered projects, 5 of those are in low-income countries. And so, I think there's so much room for growth. I think there's so much promise. But if we don't actively try to bring that opportunity to smallholder farmers, vulnerable people, and low-income countries, I think it's just going to bypass them entirely.
I'm going to add one thing from the USAID perspective. Tracy, I think you hit on it, and so did Stephen, which is that it was one of those opportunities that USAID really sees that we need to, for lack of better words, catalyze and really work further in this space. And there's a BFAD study that actually talks about how this is a missing gap, which is that we really need to engage and work with smallholder farmers, looking at agroforestry, looking at livestock, and really thinking about how we look at greenhouse gases and a secondary income and bringing them along, convincing them, making sure there's that engagement and capacity building, but then also what is that initial cost? And then making sure that there is a development partner, an NGO, and the right stakeholders that can engage and build that capacity and keep them within the market and understand the benefits long term. So with that, and listening to all 3 of our speaker panel, I would like to open it up to the audience for any questions that you might have.
Thank you for the wonderful panel. My name is Bou. I'm a CEO and a co-founder of Ebreeze, a solar irrigation company based in Senegal. We help smallholder farmers move from fuel to solar. We've been working with USAID in some of the projects there. So my question is, actually we offsetting carbon from the solar perspective. And some of the farmers union we're working with, they have around 20,000 smallholder farmers in there. And how long it will take for those smallholder farmers planting to, if they move to agroforestry to increase their carbon sequestration and so on. The question is for Martin, how long it takes from planting to start getting credit from the,
So we obviously get that question a lot, and I always hate my answer, but my answer is it depends, because it does depend strongly on where you are located, how much rain is there, how humid your climate is, for example. the number of trees that you're planting, the type of trees that you're planting, the rest of your agroforestry system. So unfortunately, that answer is not as simple. Roughly speaking, when we look at the agroforestry systems that we have been working with, and that's mostly coffee, uh, cocoa, and cashew at this moment in time, and you see that the additional trees that have been planted on a hectare are around, roughly speaking, 50. That you see that you're generating, say, between 3 to 6 to 7 credits per year per hectare from year 3 onwards, roughly speaking. Sometimes year 4, depending a little bit again on the growth rates of those trees. And that is exactly why we are now also establishing that fund to already provide the upfront, cover the upfront costs, and in certain cases also an incentive to the farmers in those initial 3 years. So, for example, 1 Acre Fund is working with a compensation per surviving tree to keep the farmers motivated at the time that carbon credits or carbon money is not flowing in yet.
Thank you. It was very interesting panel. I'm Joona Mikkola from University of Arizona and Soilwatts. I've been mainly working with smallholders in sub-Saharan Africa, and one of the main drivers of deforestation is agriculture, cropland expansion, and it's not necessarily big farmers who do that. Many times they are smallholders, and in a lot of those regions, if we look at the productivity of smallholder agriculture, it's actually declining over time. And many times there's hardly any investment going into the enhancing productivity, so how much yield they get per hectare. And I think if we trying to make a case how to invest in smallholder agriculture, probably the biggest climate impact in many areas could be from avoided deforestation. So when they can actually produce more per hectare, there's less incentive to basically convert savanna and forest into cropland. So the challenge is typically when we look at different carbon standards, there's one for soil carbon and another one for avoided deforestation, afforestation. So we've been kind of looking ways to create projects that we can actually, because in landscape, those carbon pools you work with them together. Soil carbon is related to soil organic matter. If you have higher soil organic matter, you have higher productivity. You can avoid deforestation. So I'm just thinking if that's any of you guys been thinking about that, and then how to possibly work on developing project that you invest in enhanced productivity in smaller fields, and then avoid deforestation that way. Sorry, that was a very long question.
We're definitely thinking about intensification, producing more crops with less land, producing more animal source foods with fewer animals. But how to do that? Oh, and a third thing that we're thinking about, there have been a lot of advancements or innovations lately on how to produce more, thinking of it on a nutrition scale. So more protein, more nutrients per hectare, which I think is a fascinating way to look at it. But as we're thinking about those things, I guess it's not totally obvious how to link that to carbon markets, but it's something we're thinking about in terms. I mean, it's definitely high on our priority, but I'm not aware of any methodologies that we could tap in to do that unless a farmer was actually setting aside some of their land. But from my point of view, even if we can get farmers, like a single farmer, to become more intensive, more productive on their footprint, maybe other farmers that don't make that commitment, will stop farming, put it that way, and transition to other things, or let their land go back to forestry or do something else with it. But I'm not sure how to obviously connect it to the carbon markets.
No, I think it's a fair question, right? We also get it quite often that one way or the other, we're not providing the full solution, right? So what you're saying is one thing. For example, in Latin America, what we sometimes see is that there's conservation areas on the land itself, and then they say, can you compensate for that as well? And the honest answer at this point in time is no. I think what we do try to do is to improve our methodology to, for example, include soil organic carbon, to at least compensate for that already. And to indeed make sure that we look at systems not only from a carbon perspective, but really say, okay, can we make sure that they intensify those kind of buffer zones? And can carbon then help in stimulating that? It's not perfect. It's not, definitely not. But I think we really believe, given also all of the tumult in the market, that we want to do something that we feel fully comfortable with, that it's fully reliable. And for us, that's measuring the growth in trees, right? And that's something different than avoided deforestation. And there's others that are better at that at this point in time. And that's why we said, when we start in that, we really want to do something that we know that we are capable of doing accurately, and build from that. And the way that we're building from that is trying to increase the income. So first we did above ground biomass, now we do above ground and below, hoping to add soil organic carbon. Then we hope to add biodiversity, perhaps water, that way making it a more complete system over time.
I could probably add to this one too. So we've worked on several projects globally where the primary focus is on deforestation, but we look at what are the contributing factors, what are the root causes of that, and so often that gets to agriculture. So an example of that, this was actually under a USAID funded project, but it also in partnership with Ecom, the cocoa trader processor, Hershey's, et cetera, that were also providing funding. So again, deforestation happening in Ghana. Primary underlying cause is cocoa farms, cocoa trees, declining productivity as they're getting older, low incomes, et cetera. And so we put a plan into place there, which was agroforestry oriented, but also had rehabilitation as a part of it as well. So getting new trees in, but during that transition period, ensuring that they have other crops that they can generate income from. In that case, going back to your original question, there really wasn't a carbon market benefit to conserving the forested land that those individuals had rights to, but we tried to give them as many other financial incentives as possible to make that worth their effort. I would say that perhaps to address the question in terms of avoided deforestation and a benefit to farmers, what I mentioned earlier in terms of jurisdictional REDD+, where you're looking at the actual what's happening at a national level or smaller jurisdictional level for deforestation, and then providing compensation to the community based off of what's happening there. So any one landholder, they're not going to get that much benefit from avoided deforestation from a carbon market perspective, but perhaps at a community level, there could be pooled funds, part of a jurisdictional REDD+ program that would benefit that community, and they could choose what to do with that funding.
Can I add one thing? Can we make sure that we then work together to make sure that when we're talking about avoided deforestation, we're talking about forest, so that the farmers can still be part of carbon programs? Because sometimes that's a bit tricky, and that I think is a pity for those farmers. So I'll reach out to you on that.
I'll quickly add one thing. So Tracy mentioned it earlier, but Feed the Future is USAID and the US government's flagship agriculture program working in a variety of countries. And this really looks at specific crops, looks at diversification, livelihoods, and really focusing on which areas, the types of seeds, early warning systems, and really trying to help farmers. So it doesn't necessarily address the problem completely, but we are looking also at climate smart practices and integrating that with sustainable landscapes, which really looks at this idea of deforestation and desertification as well. So, that's another aspect, not necessarily in the carbon market space, but really trying to mitigate those impacts from farmers and trying to expand. In the interest of time, we can maybe take one small question more.
Hi. Thanks for this super interesting. Very quick question. In my experience working with smallholder farmers, cash is king. Cash as early as possible, as quickly as possible, and as simple as possible. And in many ways, carbon markets, I can see the growth in that direction, but it's hard. It's just very hard. So I'd love to hear any numbers that you have. And I know this is, you need not have all the numbers in your head, but the revenues to farmers from carbon as a percentage of the revenues for a harvest. Because what I've seen in many cases, unfortunately, is that carbon revenues are not an incentive for changing behavior, but rather a sweetener that supports an existing behavior. So when I go to a farmer and they say, hey, should I plant sugarcane or should I plant these trees? Sometimes the economics do not work, even with carbon. And if I tell them, wait for 4 years, forget about it. No, not even close. So I'd love to hear if you have any numbers around what is the percentage that you've seen from carbon revenues to the farmer, and the pocket of the farmer in terms of cash, as a percentage of their total harvest. Because sometimes it's unfortunately still a little bit low. And sorry that it sounds a little bit negative, because I struggle and I try as well.
There we go again. From my perspective, it depends, but it does depend, obviously. But roughly speaking, I think what we've seen is additional income per year around between 75 to 175 per farmer per hectare. So again, you're right, it's a sweetener. That's also why I'm careful with the word carbon farming. I think we should talk about agroforestry, right? You shouldn't do this for the carbon only. The business case is insufficient with the current market price. So you're right there. But what I do think, and that's why we try to link it to financing, is that it might help if you can use that future carbon income to ensure that they can plant the trees now and still have some additional income in those years, but at least no additional cost. And that is kind of the assumptions that we've been using. So no, they shouldn't, I think, replace sugarcane with trees per se. And we should look at the business case from the beginning to make sure that we're not stimulating anything that then again results in farmers being disappointed a little bit later. So that's kind of the idea.
And I love that you guys have a floor as well in your contracts. I think that's super useful to have like that 20 euro floor. I think that's awesome.
And unfortunately, I don't have numbers, especially. I think it would be interesting to, on a percentage basis, what that looks like.
Oh yeah, so that's again, it depends, but for some it's low, right?
Yeah.
It's like a couple of percentages.
Yeah.
In certain cases, it goes up to 20% or so.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's more than I've seen. So I think in general, you're absolutely correct. It's marginal. So I think the headline always has to be the business case in general of whatever practice you're emphasizing. If it's agroforestry, if it's other forms of regenerative agriculture, that has to be the point of emphasis in terms of what that yields long term. You talked about soil organic matter before, and building soil organic matter, increasing productivity over time. That has to be the headline. But unfortunately, that's also a transition period as well. And you might have a lag time where productivity actually drops in between. We've seen that in projects as well. So this transition finance piece is so critical to incentivize farmers to actually take these actions. So, but yeah, going back to your original point, yeah, it cannot be the driving factor economically. It's just not significant enough.
I guess I would add from the perspective of farmers that are producing, staple crops or livestock products. In the model that we're using, we recognize that the amount that would be returned to the farmer is it's too small to actually motivate them to do something. But that's why we're piloting aggregating the carbon credits in our case, at the dairy processor level. And it's enough to motivate that dairy processor to provide services that those farmers really want. And so without that, the farmers wouldn't have access to the services. So it's, I think when we work with smallholder farmers, sometimes it's not practical to think that the smallholder farmer is going to receive the carbon credit benefit directly. But if they receive advisory services or some other sort of service that makes a difference for their business, I think that's also valuable. And maybe as prices go up, that dynamic will change. I hope it does. But currently, I think this alternate model of looking at the aggregated point is still valuable and still worthwhile.
I want to thank our panel, Martina, Tracy, and Stephen, for really discussing what's going on the ground with each of your organizations and really starting the conversation for us about how we can enable smallholder farmers. Thank you to everyone for joining our session today.